Let's welcome Mike Licona.
Yes. Yes? Great. Well, good morning, everyone. I want to thank Mike Rhoda, and I'd like to thank the University of St. Thomas for inviting me to participate in this. And I'd also just like to say I've been looking forward to this because my colleagues on the evangelical side have spoken very highly of Evan. And as I've read Professor Fales' works, I've just admired the ironic tone and the fairness with which he writes. So it's good to meet you, Evan. Well, 2,000 years ago, Jesus of Nazareth made a historical impression that has been preserved accurately in some cases and been distorted in other cases. He's impacted cultures and has been the source of division, war, hope, unity, and peace. In the academic world, countless volumes have been written about Jesus concerning who he really was and what claims he really made about himself and his mission. Perhaps no other question related to who Jesus is or was has promoted the writing of endless volumes than whether Jesus was raised from the dead, as the earliest Christians had claimed. Gary Habermas, whom I regard as the leading expert on the subject, has compiled a bibliography of approximately 3,500 academic sources written on Jesus' resurrection since 1975. Now, that's a lot. That's about 90 a year. So, the bibliography in the back of my large volume is, I don't know how long it is, 55, 60 pages, something like that. And let me say, I've read a lot of that stuff, but at 90, about 90 a year, you can see it's impossible pretty much to keep up within your own topic, right, Steve? When it comes to the resurrection of Jesus. Dale Allison of Princeton is one of the leading historians of Jesus, and in his book, Resurrecting Jesus, he refers to this topic we are going to be talking about today as the prize puzzle of New Testament research. So when it comes to something to study about the New Testament, you're at the right place at the right time. So let's jump right into our discussion. We're going to be talking in this first session on whether historians are within their professional rights to investigate miracle claims. And then in the second paper, I'm going to give a historical case for the resurrection of Jesus. Now, if an event occurred and left traces, most historians hold that it can be the subject of historical investigation. But what about when the event in question is a miracle? Well, some historians assign the study of miracle claims to theologians and philosophers, asserting that historians do not possess the tools for investigating the occurrence of a miraculous event. Thus, even if a miracle had truly occurred, the historian, as historian, could never say that it occurred. It's just beyond their purview and what they can do as historians. In fact, this current topic on whether historians can investigate miracle claims is not only the subject of debate amongst biblical scholars, but it is the subject of debate amongst philosophers of history. History and Theory, the main journal for historians or philosophers of history, have been talking about this for some time. And in fact, in 2006, they devoted their theme issue to miracles and historians, and there's been some subsequent articles even to that where they've discussing it. Well, I've treated these debates at length in my most recent volume on the resurrection of Jesus, and so I won't devote time to addressing most of them in this paper. Instead, what I'm going to do in the next few moments is first, I intend to cover, I forgot to switch to Dale Allison there. I intend to cover 4 topics. First, I will define what I mean by miracle. Second, I will discuss how we might identify a miracle. Third, I'll provide a few examples of miracles. And fourth, I will address some objections to miracles. So I'll begin by defining miracle. In my research, I found 23 definitions of miracle. And there are a lot more. This is by no means exhaustive. This is one of those, what we could call an essentially contested concept. There is no consensus agreement on what we mean by miracle. I don't see any reason to get bogged down in any particular definition, and I was pleased to see as I was reading some of Evan's works that he kind of feels the same way. He's kind of flexible in it. So I'm just going to provide the following provisional definition, and we can discuss it if we need to later on. But I'm going to define miracle as an event having a supernatural cause. All right? An event having a supernatural cause. Now, by this definition, an answer to prayer is a miracle. And by the way, Evan, I know we're going to go at it a little bit here today. I'm not trying to give this kind of a definition to, it's not strategic. This is just a definition I'm laying out provisionally here. So we could say an answer to prayer is a miracle. But I want to make clear that there is a difference between defining a miracle and identifying one. Let's say that I'm looking for a job, and I go to a job interview, and I pray that I can get this job, and then I get the job. Well, did God answer my prayer? If he did, we could say it's a miracle by this definition. But did God answer it? I don't know. Maybe he did, maybe not. Maybe I was the most qualified applicant for the position. There's just really no way to know in this kind of case whether we can identify this as a miracle. So I'd like to suggest two criteria. We may recognize that an event is a miracle when A, the event is extremely unlikely to have occurred given the circumstances and or natural law, and B, the event occurs in a context or an environment that is charged with religious significance. The stronger the context is charged in this manner, the stronger the evidence becomes that we have a miracle in our hands if the historical evidence for the event is good. Now let's suppose we've got a 50-year-old male who's an atheist. He was born blind. He's never prayed to receive his sight. And then one day he and his wife are together in their home and they're having lunch. And all of a sudden, the man gets his eyesight. He goes to an ophthalmologist and says, hey, what's the deal here? And the ophthalmologist says, I have no idea. There's no medical explanation for why you've got your sight. Well, was this a miracle? I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not. I don't know. Maybe it's just an anomaly, one of those freak events of nature that he got his eyesight. But let's change the details a little. Let's say we've got the same 50-year-old man, atheist, born blind. He's never never prayed to have his sight. And one day, he and his wife are having lunch when there's a knock at the door. And they open the door, and there's a guy who looks a little sheepish, and he says, hi, my name is so-and-so, and I'm the pastor at the church down on the corner. I was having lunch with my staff, and we were praying, and a few of us independently just had this strong sense that I should come down and pray for you. And so can I do that? And so they're kind of like, this is awkward, but they let the guy in and he prays for him. And he says, Lord, I don't know what's going on here, why you want me here, but show yourselves to these folks. And immediately the guy's eyes are opened and he can see. He goes to an ophthalmologist, and the ophthalmologist has no medical explanation of why he can see. Is that a miracle? I think it is. Well, what's the difference between the two? The context in which it occurs. The latter occurs in a context or an environment that is charged with religious significance. Could it still be a coincidence? Well, I guess possible. But it just seems more plausible to think that what we have here is a miracle in our hands. Well, the early reports that Jesus of Nazareth had risen from the dead occurred in a significant context. That Jesus performed feats that amazed crowds and that both he and his followers regarded as divine miracles and exorcisms is supported by an almost unanimous consensus of historians of Jesus. That would include atheists, agnostics, Jews, liberals, moderates, conservatives, everyone. That Jesus viewed himself as God's eschatological agent, chosen to usher in God's kingdom, is also widely recognized by historians of Jesus and amply attested in the sources. Now, these data create a significantly charged religious context in which the reports of Jesus' resurrection occurs. And this context becomes even more charged if, with a growing number of scholars, we grant that Jesus predicted his imminent and violent death and that this would be followed shortly thereafter by his resurrection. Accordingly, if the hypothesis that Jesus rose from the dead is superior to competing natural hypotheses to explain the relevant historical facts, we're justified in concluding that a miracle occurred. But what part can God play in a historical hypothesis? Well, there are two ways we can approach the matter. First is to acknowledge the occurrence of the event and posit a theoretical entity for the cause. Physicists posit theoretical entities to explain observable phenomena on a regular basis. Black holes, quarks, strings, gluons have never been observed, probably never will, according to John Polkinghorne. And since the John Templeton Foundation is funding this event, I figured I'd throw in a Templeton laureate there, right? So, in a similar manner, if the two criteria for identifying a miracle are met, as we find in the resurrection hypothesis, and if the resurrection hypothesis turns out being the best hypothesis, the historian may conclude that Jesus was raised and propose God as the theoretical entity who raised him. After all, I think most of us would agree that if Jesus was raised, God is probably the best candidate for it. A second approach is more modest in its conclusion, it's the one that I take. Historians can offer a positive verdict pertaining to the historicity of an event while leaving its cause undetermined. This is a common practice of historians outside the Guild of Biblical Scholars. When the Reichstag burned in 1933, Hitler blamed the communists and used it as an opportunity to suspend civil liberties and destroy his political opponents, allowing the Nazi Party to gain a political majority. However, debate continues today pertaining to whether the fire was caused by the communists or staged by the Nazis. So while historians remain uncertain pertaining to the cause of the fire, that does not impede them from concluding that the fire occurred and that the Reichstag burned. We may say something similar when considering at least some reports of Jesus' miracles. While there is widespread agreement among historians of Jesus that he performed deeds that both he and his followers regarded as divine miracles and exorcisms, even those historians who are open to divine causation may admit there is usually insufficient evidence for determining whether a psychosomatic or supernatural cause was responsible for the improved states of some of those healed. In this manner, the historian can acknowledge the historicity of the event without adjudicating on its nature or cause. One could even call it a freak event or an anomaly and refrain from statements pertaining to its ontology. Now, let's suppose for a moment that the historical evidence for Jesus' remarkable return to life after having been tortured and crucified is so strong that natural hypotheses cannot sufficiently account for the relevant historical facts, while the resurrection hypothesis accounts for all of them very well. Even if a historian remained unwilling to grant that a miracle had occurred, she could, in principle, grant the historicity of Jesus' remarkable return to life while leaving the matter of the cause unanswered. With this in mind, I want to propose there are good reasons for believing miracles occur even today. In his book, Miracles, which appears in 2 volumes, Craig Keener provides hundreds of cases of miracles, many of which have been reported by eyewitnesses in modern times. And Keener himself interviewed several of those eyewitnesses. Rather than cite some of those he mentions, I'm going to provide 3 reports from my own friends and acquaintances, all of which involve extreme answers to prayer. Example number 1. In June 1987, Loy Reed and his daughter were involved in a terrible car accident, were hospitalized, and Loy was in a coma. On July 4th, Loy had been in a coma for 21 days. At 4 p.m. that afternoon, a number of members of Loy's church were having a 4th of July picnic and took a few minutes to pray for him. And right around that time, at 4 p.m., Loy, who was several miles away in the hospital, awakened from his coma. But it gets even better, because there were 3 other patients in the same room with him, all of whom had been in a coma from 1 to 6 months, and all of them came out of their coma. Example number 2. Don Piper was a Southern Baptist pastor and driving home from a pastor's conference on a rainy day in 1989 when he was involved in a serious car accident on a bridge in Texas in which his body was mangled and he was killed. He was declared dead by medical personnel and remained so for approximately 90 minutes, during which he claims to have been in heaven. I spoke at a Christian camp just outside of Houston last month, and one of the camp directors took me to the spot, the very bridge on which the accident had occurred, since it was only about 10 minutes away from the camp. Another Southern Baptist pastor who had just attended the same conference but who did not know Don showed up at the scene of the accident. The pastor felt God impressing upon him to go lay his hands on the dead man and pray for him. Of course, he felt strange about doing this, and when you realize he was Southern Baptist, you can understand even more so why he felt strange about doing this. But he received permission from the police officer on the scene and crawled through the trunk of the wrecked car, the only way inside, and placed one of his hands on Don's shoulder and began praying for him. And Don returned to life. Now, Don tells of his experience in his book, 90 Minutes in Heaven. He kindly spoke to my mom last July, 3 days before she died, and called her on the phone as a favor, and it just gave her an amazing comfort as she laid there in her hospice bed. The very last words my mom uttered, because she hadn't spoken all day. She was at that point where she really couldn't speak. But when Don spoke to her, he spoke to her for about 11 minutes, and she mustered all the strength she could and said, "Thank you." And those were her very last words. Whether Don actually visited heaven is something that can be debated. Of course, we could never really confirm that per se, but that is a separate issue from the remarkable answer to prayer of Don coming back to life. Example number 3. In 2009, I was corresponding with a guy via email who was once a Christian but is now a staunch atheist. When I mentioned the occurrence of miracles, he said, and I quote, no, I'm not quoting here, but he did say, "Oh, been there, done that." He then relayed the following, and I quote, "One time my church desperately needed $7,641 in order to keep going. After an all-night prayer meeting, my dad went to pick up the mail, and in it was a check for exactly $7,641 from someone who didn't even know the church needed the money, but had heard one of the pastors speak a few years ago. My dad contacted the giver, and she said that after she'd heard the pastor speak, she felt God wanted her to put some cash in an annuity and give it to our church. The process took several years, and just days before she decided to close the account and send the accrued money to the church. And it happened to be the exact amount that was needed right after an all-night prayer meeting," end quote. Interestingly, he wrote just a few lines later, quote, "I looked as hard as I could, but finally realized I had no good reasons to think God existed," end quote. All 3 of these events appear to have had a supernatural cause, were extremely unlikely to have occurred given the circumstances and or natural law, and occurred in an environment that was charged with religious significance. I could provide several other stories, and I'm certain several of you in this room probably have some stories of your own that you could recall of how God's worked in a miraculous way in your life or in the life of one of your friends. And when we add other cases, such as well-evidenced near-death experiences, experiences of apparitions of the dead during which recipients receive accurate information they could not have known otherwise, the evidence for the supernatural component to reality is so strong that one can hardly deny its existence and still call themselves a realist. So let's pause and review what we've just covered. A miracle is an event having a supernatural cause. We may recognize that an event is a miracle when the event A is extremely unlikely to have occurred given the circumstances and or natural law, and B, it occurs in a context or environment charged with religious significance. There are 2 approaches historians may take regarding the use or non-use of God in a hypothesis. After concluding that the particular event occurred that appears miraculous in nature, historians may A, posit a theoretical entity as the cause, or B, leave the cause undetermined. Finally, we observe the existence of a supernatural component to reality, namely miracles, providing a general background knowledge or plausibility related to miracle hypotheses. Accordingly, if a miracle has occurred, it can be the subject of a historian's investigation. One can still deny the historicity of a particular miracle given a lack of evidence, but historians are not prohibited from adjudicating on the historicity of a report because of an event's purportedly miraculous nature. That's a positive case for the ability of historians to investigate miracle claims. Now, of course, not all agree, and there are a number of arguments forwarded in opposition. As I mentioned earlier, I've addressed most of these in my large volume on Jesus' resurrection, so given time limitations, I'm going to devote the remainder of this paper toward addressing those arguments provided by Professor Fales, who argues that belief in miracles is not reasonable. He provides three arguments in support. I'm going to address the first two in this paper, and then I'll reserve the third for my second paper where it will be more appropriately answered. Evan's first argument is miracles are metaphysically impossible. Now, that's not that they're terribly improbable. It's that they're impossible. And in support, he cites the laws of conservation of energy and momentum, and specifically within them, Newton's third law. He says that, quote, these state that, quote, in a causally closed system, total energy and momentum remain unchanged over time, end quote. So, quote, how does God, who has no mass energy, exert forces on matter? Given that every force is balanced by an opposite force, what does the matter push back against? God's body? Moreover, Newton's third law is not defeasible. It allows for no exceptions, end quote. Well, I have three replies. Number one, the laws of nature describe what goes on in our universe when it's left to itself. A miracle is not a violation of the laws of nature. A miracle is not an exception to the laws of nature. A miracle is an instance when nature is not left to itself. Now, let me provide a little illustration. Watch this pen. Now, I could do that 1,000,000 times over, and it's always going to have the same results, right? Now, watch this. Amazing, huh? Why didn't the pen fall to the floor? Well, because my hand entered the scene and interrupted the normal course of events. In a similar way, a miracle is when the hand of God comes into our world and alters the normal course of events. It is when nature is not left to itself. Second, Evan's approach to science is in conflict with what we observe in our world. Now, I mentioned three extreme answers to prayer, and many more examples could be provided. So we observe the occurrence of authentic miracles in our world. What then are we to make of Evan's claim that the laws of conservation of energy and momentum are indefeasible? Well, many scientists and philosophers contend these laws are defeasible. Robin Collins, who is a philosopher of science and a specialist in quantum physics, says that quantum mechanics, the cornerstone of modern physics, provides a good case of interaction, law-like correlation, in which there's no energy or momentum exchanges. Collins adds that these quantum correlations, quote, are pervasive throughout the microscopic world, playing a fundamental role in the operation of nature, end quote. Timothy McGrew, like Evan, is a philosopher and epistemologist. He observes that we know there are K-mesons in which their decay violates the time reversal invariance of a Newtonian picture. Thus, Newton's third law is defeasible. In his book, General Relativity, Robert Wald, who is a physicist and a specialist in general relativity, he states that in general relativity, there's no way of accounting for the energy of the gravitational field in terms of local interactions. And even globally, we can only speak of the conservation of gravitational energy in the universe in terms of models that are not representative of our universe. Now, I'm not a physicist and I'm not a philosopher. So very honestly, I couldn't tell you the difference between a K-meson and a quantum correlation. So what happens, what am I left with then? I've got two contradictory approaches to science. What do I do? Well, I'm going to go with the one that is compatible with what I observe going on in our world, the world in which we live. Now, I appreciate philosophers. I tease Bill Craig all the time and say, because he just finished his book on abstract objects that he's been working on for a decade. And I said, Bill, you philosophers answer all the questions nobody's asking. And but he responds, very well as a good philosopher, and he says, yeah, but we're answering the questions people should be asking. In preparation for today's discussion, when I was reading Evan's work, at one point in it he says, it'd be interesting if he could be shut into a sealed room and in this experiment to see if he made a lot of decisions, whether that would increase the amount of measurable energy in the room. Well, I think such questions are of interest. And it's these kinds of questions that got us to the moon, I think. So they are important. But sometimes we got to stop working in our theoretical world and come down to terra firma, where life occurs, and where people live and die, get married and divorced. And when we do this, we observe that miracles occur. Third, for the sake of argument, let's say that Evan is correct and that the laws of conservation of energy and momentum are indefeasible. We would still have to possess such a thorough understanding of supernatural beings, who of course would be superior to us in their essence and nature. We would still have to have such a thorough understanding of them that we would know that they are incapable of manifesting themselves in such a manner as to create the same kind of effect on material objects as do other material objects. And we do not have this knowledge. So we can see that Evan's first argument, that miracles are metaphysically impossible, cannot withstand critical scrutiny. So let's move along to his second argument against miracles. This one is borrowed from David Hume, and we heard it yesterday in yesterday's, the last lecture that was given. We may refer to it as the balancing argument. Now, applied to Jesus' resurrection, it looks like this. Natural laws inform us that corpses do not come back to life. This is supported by a massive amount of evidence, and our understanding of science also backs this up very strongly. We also observe that corpses do not come back to life with an exceptionless regularity. So we've got a lot of weight on this side of the argument. The evidence we have to the contrary is based on human testimony. And human testimony is often unreliable. It's not to say it's unreliable all the time. It's to say that it's unreliable some of the time. And it's certainly not going to be as reliable as often as we can count on natural laws obtaining. Okay? So, on balance, when we weigh these evidences, the evidence that we get from the consistency of natural law is going to be far superior to the evidence we get from the inconsistency of human testimony, and therefore we should conclude that miracles in general and Jesus' resurrection in particular do not and did not occur. Well, I think this argument sounds persuasive at first, but when we look at its foundation, we use that Hume, when building it, used the wrong parts. You see, remember, the laws of nature tell us what go on in our universe when it's left to itself. We can see with an exceptionless regularity that corpses don't come back to life. We have a massive amount of evidence that corpses do not come back to life when left to themselves. Science informs us very clearly that corpses do not come back to life when left to themselves. This is what we observe with an exceptionless regularity. Corpses do not come back to life when left to themselves. But what happens then if we have a supernatural being who decides that, in the case of Jesus' corpse, this supernatural being doesn't want it to be left to itself? Well, then that's a game changer, and all bets are off in regards to natural law. If natural law describes what goes on in our universe when it's left to itself, and God, say, comes in and says, I'm not going to leave Jesus' corpse to itself, that changes everything. And so the question is no longer, what happens to corpses when left to themselves? That's the question, the way that Hume gives it. But that's not the question to ask. The question is there sufficient evidence to suggest that in the case of Jesus, his corpse was not left to itself? Now, maybe you think, this balancing argument, the answer I've just provided to it is fine as long as a supernatural being exists. Otherwise, it's just ad hoc. I would agree, it would be ad hoc if we didn't have evidence for supernatural. So remember the three radical answers to prayer that I provided just a few moments ago. There is a supernatural component to our world. And what I'm showing here is that Evan's arguments against the occurrence of miracles fails in both principle and in practice. I'll conclude by reviewing what I've just argued. A miracle is an event having a supernatural cause. We may recognize that an event is a miracle when the event A is extremely unlikely to have occurred given the circumstances and/or natural law, and B, it occurs in an environment or context charged with religious significance. There are two approaches historians may take regarding the use or non-use of God in a hypothesis. After concluding that a particular event occurred that appears miraculous in nature, historians may A, posit a theoretical entity as the cause, or B, leave the cause undetermined. We then observed evidence strongly suggesting miracles occur, providing us with a general background knowledge or plausibility related to miracle hypotheses. Finally, I contended that the two major arguments against miracles provided by Evan do not hold up under critical scrutiny. His first argument is that miracles are metaphysically impossible, but I argued, 1, the laws of nature describe what nature does when left to itself, whereas a miracle is an occasion when nature is not left to itself. 2, Evan's approach to science is in conflict with what we observe in our world, and many scientists and philosophers contend the laws of conservation of energy and momentum are defeasible. And 3, even if some natural laws are indefeasible, we don't know enough about spirit beings and God to say they cannot have the same effect on material objects as do other material objects. Evan's second argument, the balancing argument, says the evidence from the consistency of natural law trumps the evidence of inconsistent human testimony. I replied that Hume used the wrong parts to build the foundation of his argument, since if God had chosen to raise Jesus, that's a different matter altogether than what corpses do when left to themselves. Thus, neither of Evan's arguments hold up to critical scrutiny. Accordingly, if a miracle has occurred, it can be the subject of a historian's investigation. One can still deny the historicity of a miracle hypothesis given the lack of evidence, but historians are not prohibited from adjudicating on the historicity of an event because of its purportedly miraculous nature. Thank you.